Emelio Viaña is drinking coffee when the bullet shatters his thigh. It's March 8, 1961, one day before his 53rd birthday. He's sitting in his sweet potato field on Lubang Island with his two teenage sons, Protazio and Diane, taking a lunch break after a morning of hard work. The shot comes from nowhere. Then another. Diane screams as the round tears through his leg. The boys freeze. Somewhere in the tree line, a man in a tattered uniform watches through rifle sights. He's been watching for hours, waiting for them to separate, to become vulnerable. Now he moves through the undergrowth with practiced silence, a bolo knife in his hand. Protazio clamps his hand over his mouth to stop from crying out. One sound, and they're dead. The war has been over for 16 years. But nobody told Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and in December 1944, he was 22 years old and absolutely certain of his purpose. Second Lieutenant Onoda came from Kamikawa, a small village in Wakayama Prefecture, where his father taught and his family traced their lineage back to samurai warriors. He'd been a defiant child. His mother once took him to the family shrine and demanded he commit harakiri after he'd knifed a friend in a fight. He couldn't do it then. The Emperor's army would make sure he never had to. At the Nakano School in Tokyo, they'd trained him in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and survival. Not the regular infantry school. This was the Futamata branch, where they created intelligence officers, where they taught you that surrender was not an option and suicide was forbidden. I liked this, Onoda would write decades later. This kind of training seemed to suit my personality. His orders for Lubang Island were specific. Destroy the airstrip, destroy the pier, harass the enemy, and wait for the Imperial Japanese Army to return. Under no circumstances surrender. Under no circumstances take your own life. Whatever happens, we'll come back for you. When he arrived on Lubang, a small island 93 miles southwest of Manila, officers who outranked him prevented him from completing his sabotage mission. The Americans landed on February 28, 1945, and took the island with barely a fight. Most Japanese soldiers surrendered or died. Onoda took 3 men into the mountains, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. Lubang is not a large island. Roughly 50 square miles of volcanic rock, coconut groves, and dense jungle covering a central mountain range. The climate is tropical, humid, suffocating, with monsoon rains that turn trails into rivers and rot everything that isn't constantly maintained. Perfect terrain for men who wanted to hide. Hell for men trying to find them. The 4 soldiers established a circuit, an elliptical path around the mountains, never staying anywhere long. They survived on bananas, coconuts, stolen rice. They learned which farmers left their fields unguarded, which cattle wandered too far from the villages. They kept their weapons immaculate. The Arisaka Type 99 rifles, the ammunition belts, the grenades. Rust was the enemy. So was complacency. In October 1945, they found a leaflet. The war ended on 15th of August. Come down from the mountains. They studied it carefully. The paper, the ink, the Japanese characters. They decided it was propaganda. They'd been fired on by search parties. If the war was over, why would anyone shoot at them? Later that year, leaflets signed by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the 14th Area Army, were dropped from planes. Surrender orders. The 4 men analyzed every word, every phrase, looking for proof of authenticity. They concluded it was an American forgery. Yamashita would never order them to surrender. In February 1952, letters from their families were dropped, along with photographs. Akatsu had already deserted by then, walked away in September 1949, surrendered 6 months later. The other 3 considered it a betrayal. They looked at the photographs of homes and families they didn't recognize, buildings that weren't there when they left, different hairstyles, strange clothing, obviously fake. The Americans had gotten sophisticated. What Onoda and his men couldn't know, or refused to accept, was that their hometowns had been bombed and rebuilt. That Japan had changed so fundamentally it was no longer the same country they'd left. That the emperor they served with such devotion had renounced his divinity. That their families believed them dead. The psychological trap was elegant and complete. Every piece of evidence that the war had ended only reinforced their belief that it hadn't. The more the world tried to tell them the truth, the more convinced they became they were being lied to. And so they kept fighting, kept hiding, kept waiting for orders that would never come. At night, Onoda thought about his oldest brother, Toshio, about his family, about the day the Japanese army would return and retake Lubang. He kept his body strong, his mind sharp, his rifle clean. The son of heaven would be proud. By 1954, there were 3. Shimada took a bullet in the leg during a raid in June 1953. Onoda nursed him back to health. But on May 7, 1954, a Philippine Army training patrol accidentally encountered them in the jungle. Shimada died in the firefight. By 1972, there were 2. Just Onoda and Kazuka, closer than brothers, moving through their endless circuit around the mountains. Until October 19th, when they burned a pile of rice the villagers had harvested, a signal to any Japanese forces that they were still alive and fighting. The local police responded. Kazuka fell in the shootout. After that, there was only one. Hiroo Onoda, alone in the jungle, carrying out his war against an enemy that no longer existed. It is February 20th, 1974. Norio Suzuki is 24 years old, a college dropout with long hair and an adventurer's restless spirit. He's spent 4 years wandering through Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. When he returned to Japan in 1972, he told his friends he felt surrounded by fake. He needed something real, something impossible. So he set out to find 3 things, in order: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. The newspapers had reported Kazuka's death, which meant Onoda might still be alive. Suzuki arrives on Lubang with a backpack, a camera, and the absolute confidence that he'll succeed where government search parties have failed for 3 decades. The villagers think he's insane. The local mayor tries to discourage him. The island is dangerous. There's a man in the mountains who kills people. Suzuki goes anyway. He's read everything about Onoda. He knows the circuit pattern, the likely campsites, the psychological profile. He knows that Onoda will be watching long before Suzuki sees him, so he doesn't try to hide. He walks the jungle trails loudly, obviously, wearing bright colors. He camps in clearings. He lights fires. He calls out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, the emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." 4 days. That's all it takes. On the 4th day, Suzuki wakes to find a rifle barrel pointed at his head. The man holding it wears a tattered uniform, carefully patched and maintained. His face is weathered but alert, eyes constantly scanning. He's been living in this jungle for 30 years, but his military bearing is perfect. Suzuki doesn't move. "Onoda-san," he says carefully, "the emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." Onoda later describes this moment. "This hippie boy Suzuki came to the island to listen to the feelings of a Japanese soldier. Suzuki asked me why I would not come out. They talk for hours. Suzuki shows him photographs from Japan, the tall buildings, the technology, the modern world. Onoda studies them like he studied all the other evidence over the years. It could still be propaganda. Sophisticated, convincing, but propaganda nonetheless. But something about Suzuki is different. He's not trying to capture Onoda. He's not trying to trick him. He genuinely wants to understand, and Suzuki listens, really listens, to what Onoda has to say. Finally, Onoda explains his position. He's a soldier. He has orders. He cannot surrender without being properly relieved of duty by his commanding officer. I am a soldier and remain true to my duties. Suzuki asks who that commanding officer is. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda says, commander of the Special Intelligence Squadron of the 14th Area Army. He gave me my final instructions in 1944. What if I can find him? Suzuki asks. What if I bring him here to relieve you of duty? Onoda agrees. He'll wait. Suzuki takes photographs, proof of the encounter. Then he walks out of the jungle and flies back to Japan. The media circus that follows is instant and overwhelming. Suzuki has proof. Actual photographs of Onoda, alive, still in uniform, still armed. The Japanese government mobilizes. They track down Major Taniguchi. He's not a major anymore. He's an old man working in a bookstore in Tokyo, trying to forget the war. But when they tell him Onoda is alive and waiting for orders, Taniguchi doesn't hesitate. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi returns to Lubang Island. The government has arranged everything: transportation, security, media access. But none of that matters. What matters is an old major and a young lieutenant meeting in the jungle to complete a chain of command that began 3 decades earlier. Suzuki guides them to the meeting point. Onoda is there, waiting, rifle in hand. He comes to attention. Taniguchi returns the salute. The major speaks clearly, formally, using the proper military language. In accordance with the Imperial Command, the 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. In accordance with Military Headquarters Command, No. A2003. The Special Squadron in the Chief of Staff's headquarters is relieved of all military duties. Units and individuals under the command of the Special Squadron are to cease military activities and operations immediately and place themselves under the command of the nearest superior officer. When no officer can be found, they are to communicate with the American or Philippine forces and follow their directives. Onoda listens to every word. Then, for the first time in 10,416 days, he accepts that his war is over. On March 10, 1974, 2nd Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda walks out of the jungle and formally surrenders. He wears his uniform, 30 years old, carefully maintained, still bearing his insignia. He carries his sword, his Arisaka Type 99 rifle, with 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and the dagger his mother gave him in 1944 to kill himself if he was ever captured. He never needed the dagger. On March 11th, President Ferdinand Marcos holds a formal surrender ceremony at Malacañang Palace in Manila. International media films every moment. Onoda, in full uniform, presents his sword to Marcos. The Philippine president accepts it, grants Onoda a full pardon for any crimes committed during his guerrilla campaign, and returns the sword. Just like that, 30 years are forgiven. Onoda flies to Japan. 8,000 people greet him at the airport. NHK, Japan's national broadcaster, films his arrival. His family, who had believed him dead since 1959, see him for the first time since he deployed at age 22. He's 52 now, half his life spent in the jungle. Japan needs Onoda to be a hero. The country has changed, become wealthy, modern, progressive. Some see this as selling out traditional values. Onoda represents something they've lost: discipline, loyalty, sacrifice, unwavering commitment. He becomes a symbol for conservative Japan, a reminder of the old virtues. The government offers him substantial back pay, 30 years of military salary. He refuses it. He writes a best-selling autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. He gives interviews. He becomes a celebrity. but he's profoundly uncomfortable with the attention and deeply disturbed by what Japan has become. "There are so many tall buildings and automobiles in Tokyo," he says. "Television might be convenient, but it has no influence on my life." The values he served, the Japan he fought for, no longer exists. In April 1975, like his older brother before him, Onoda leaves Japan for Brazil. He buys a ranch in Colonia Jamic, a Japanese-Brazilian community in Mato Grosso do Sul. He becomes a cattle farmer. He marries in 1976. He tries to build a quieter life. But the story follows him. In 1980, he reads about a Japanese teenager who murdered his parents. It crystallizes something for him, a sense that young people have lost their way, that they need the survival skills and discipline he learned in the jungle. In 1984, he establishes the Onoda Shizenjuku, the Onoda Nature School, in Fukushima Prefecture. Educational camps teaching survival skills, camping, the values he believes essential. He spends 3 months a year in Brazil, the rest in Japan, training young people. The myth of Hiroo Onoda is powerful and persistent. The loyal soldier, the man who kept fighting because he swore an oath, the embodiment of Bushido and duty. Films are made. Books are written. Werner Herzog writes a novel about him. He's studied, analyzed, admired. But there's another story, one Onoda didn't include in his memoir. On Lubang Island, the Filipino families remember differently. Emelio Viaña bled out in a small boat, his sons paddling frantically toward help that would arrive too late. His widow never remarried. His sons carried the trauma for life. Protazio, who saw his father shot while drinking coffee, who hid in the field while a man with a knife hunted them. Emelio wasn't the only one. Filipino media interviewed villagers who lived through those 3 decades. Up to 30 civilians were killed, shot during ambushes, cut down with bolo knives or swords. Farmers checking their fields, fishermen near the coast, people going about their daily lives who became targets in a war that existed only in Onoda's mind. The pattern was consistent. Onoda and his men would watch, wait for victims to become isolated, then attack. Never more than 1 bullet per body. Efficient, professional. Onoda described these as guerrilla operations against enemy forces. The victims' families called it murder. When Onoda visited Lubang in 1996, his wife Machie had arranged a $10,000 scholarship donation for the local school. The town council presented him with a resolution asking for compensation for 7 specific victims. 50 relatives of the dead staged a protest during his visit. "He killed my brother, shot him during a raid on our village," one man said to reporters. "Now he comes here and they call him a hero." Marcos had pardoned him. The Japanese government celebrated him. But the people of Lubang, who had lived in fear for 3 decades, who had lost fathers and brothers and sons, received no justice and no answers. The darker truth is this. At some point, Onoda must have known the war was over. The evidence was overwhelming, not just leaflets and letters, but the complete absence of Japanese military activity, the rebuilding of peace, the passage of years. Mia Stewart, an Australian filmmaker whose great-uncle Emilio Viaña was one of Onoda's victims, spent 15 years researching his story. Her conclusion: "I believe that Onoda actually knew the war was over early on, but he continued to engage in guerrilla warfare, terrorizing the island, and civilians became victims of his delusion and his continued violence. The war in Onoda's mind may have lasted 30 years. But for the people of Lubang, the war he actually fought lasted much longer, and its casualties were real. What does it mean to be a soldier when the war is over?" Onoda's story reveals something uncomfortable about loyalty, duty, and the human capacity for self-deception. He was trained to never surrender, to survive at all costs, to wait for orders that might never come. The Nakano school had prepared him perfectly for his mission. But nobody prepared him for the possibility that the mission itself might become meaningless. The psychology is brutally simple. Once you've killed for a cause, it becomes almost impossible to admit the cause no longer exists. To accept that the war was over would mean accepting that Shimada died for nothing, that Kozuka's life was wasted, that every person they killed in those 30 years was murdered rather than killed in combat. The human mind protects itself from that kind of reckoning. It's easier to believe the leaflets are fake, the photographs are propaganda, the world is lying to you. The tragic irony is that Onoda's training saved his life, but trapped him in a psychological prison far more secure than any physical barrier. He was the perfect soldier, disciplined, loyal, resourceful, unwavering. These virtues, taken to their extreme, became pathology. This story also exposes the gap between military mythology and moral reality. The Japanese government needed Onoda to be a hero, evidence that traditional values still mattered, that sacrifice and loyalty weren't obsolete. Conservative groups embraced him as a symbol. His memoir became a bestseller. He was awarded honors, invited to speak, celebrated. But heroism requires context. In war, following orders and fighting the enemy is heroic. After the war, killing unarmed civilians is murder, no matter what uniform you're wearing. The pardon Marcos granted was political expedience, not justice. The families of the victims were never compensated, never acknowledged, never given the recognition that their losses mattered as much as Onoda's suffering. There were other Japanese holdouts, soldiers who continued fighting after 1945 because they didn't know or didn't believe the war had ended. Captain Sakai Oba held out on Saipan with 46 men. Shoichi Yokoi hid in the Guam jungle until 1972, too frightened to surrender even though he knew the war was over. Private Teruo Nakamura was found on Morotai Island in Indonesia in December 1974, the last confirmed holdout, surrendering 9 months after Onoda. But Onoda became the most famous because his story fit a narrative people wanted to believe. The loyal soldier, faithful to the end. It's easier to romanticize than to reckon with the human cost of that loyalty. After his return to Japan, Onoda said, "I don't consider those 30 years a waste of time. Without that experience, I wouldn't have my life today." He embraced his celebrity, then retreated from it. He built a new life in Brazil, trained young people in Japan, tried to find meaning in what he'd endured. He died in January 2014 at age 91, still defending his choices, still believing his mission had been necessary. Norio Suzuki, the young adventurer who found Onoda, continued his quest. He found a panda. He married. He never stopped looking for the abominable snowman. In November 1986, while searching for a yeti in the Himalayas, Suzuki was killed in an avalanche. He was 37 years old. His remains were discovered a year later. 2 men, both driven by impossible missions, both willing to die for their purpose. Both became legends, but only one is remembered as a hero. Today, a shrine stands on Lubang where Kozuka died. It's supposed to be a peace monument. But whose peace? The Japanese tourists who visit remember a soldier's sacrifice. The Filipino villagers remember terror and loss and violence that continued long after any justification. The lesson isn't simple. War creates soldiers like Onoda, men trained to follow orders, to endure, to never quit. But when wars end, those same qualities can become dangerous. The ability to survive becomes the inability to adapt. The refusal to surrender becomes the refusal to see reality. Loyalty becomes delusion. Duty becomes obsession. And the cost is always borne by someone else. The final truth about Hiroo Onoda is that he was both, a dedicated soldier and a killer of civilians. a man of unwavering loyalty and profound self-deception, a symbol of traditional values and a cautionary tale about those same values taken too far. History is complex. Heroes are rarely pure. And the stories we tell ourselves about war, about loyalty, about sacrifice, about duty, always leave out the people who paid the price for someone else's certainty. Emelio Viaña was drinking coffee when the bullet hit him. One day before his 53rd birthday, he died in a boat, his sons paddling toward help that would come too late. His family never forgot. The world barely noticed. Lieutenant Onoda came home to parades and interviews and a hero's welcome. He wrote a book. He became a symbol. He lived to be 91. That's how wars work, even the ones that exist only in the mind. Someone always pays. It's rarely the person holding the rifle.